The mountains had a way of making a man forget the sound of his own voice. Silas Boone had lived long enough among the pines and granite ridges that silence clung to him like a second skin. His cabin stood lonesome on a ridge above the river, smoke curling from its chimney against a gray November sky. The logs were weathered, the roof patched with tin, and the man who lived inside was no less weathered than the home he'd built with his own hands. Some said he was made of stone himself, a man who carried loss so long he'd forgotten how to set it down. When winter threatened to bite harder than usual, Silas rode into town and placed a notice: cook wanted, room and board provided, payment in trade. He wasn't seeking company, only a pair of hands to keep him fed, a body to keep the hearth warm with work. Nothing more. What he received was a woman with her head bowed and her belly rounded, stepping off the stagecoach with only a carpet bag clutched tight against her chest. Her name was Clara May Whitfield. The whispers began before she even touched ground. "She's a widow," someone murmured near the hitching post, "carrying another man's child." Another voice chuckled low. "Boone will regret that one." Clara heard them, though she did not look their way. Her shawl was threadbare, her shoes scuffed, her face pale from the journey. She stood with the stubborn quiet of someone who had been pushed too many times already, and when Silas Boone approached, broad-shouldered, silent, shadowed under his wide hat, she did not flinch, though shame burned hot in her chest. He looked at her, looked at the swell of her stomach, and something in his jaw tightened. He had expected a worker, not a burden. But he did not speak his disappointment aloud. Instead, he tipped his hat curtly, hefted her bag onto the wagon, and gestured for her to follow. She climbed in without a word, and the wagon creaked northward, away from the judging eyes of town. The first days in the cabin carried the weight of two silences pressed against one another. Clara May cooked, stew for dried beans, biscuits heavy but filling, and Silas ate with his head lowered, saying nothing more than a gruff, "Thank you." She swept the floors, patched the blankets, stoked the fire, while he busied himself with splitting logs outside until his arms ached. At night, he sat in his chair and whittled, while she curled near the fire with her hands resting on her stomach. Once, thinking he could not hear, she cried softly into her blanket. The sound struck him deeper than any storm wind. He did not move, did not speak, but in his chest something heavy shifted, as though the silence no longer fit him the way it used to. In town, the whispers did not stop. Clara walked to the general store for flour, her eyes on the ground, and the gossip swirled around her like dust. Zeke Turner leaned over the counter, smirking. Boone brought home a ruined woman. Shame he didn't know better. Clara's hands trembled as she counted coins, though she forced her chin upward, dignity clinging to her like a tattered ribbon. Silas saw it. He did not answer the gossip, did not raise his voice. But outside, where the air was sharp with winter, he laid a new shawl across Clara's shoulders. Not a word passed between them, yet her eyes burned with sudden tears she refused to let fall. Back at the cabin, she hummed as she kneaded bread, a hymn so faint it seemed more memory than song. Silas, stepping in from the cold, stopped at the doorway and listened. The sound filled the logs and rafters with a warmth he had not known in years. Later that evening, he found his old shirt mended, stitches neat, careful, stitched with patience rather than duty. He touched the fabric, his hand lingering, as if it were the first kindness given to him in half a lifetime. One stormy night, snow piling high against the cabin walls, he found Clara dozing in her chair by the fire, head fallen back, shadows painting her face soft. She had stayed awake long hours, tending the stew, mending socks, feeding the fire. Quietly, without letting the floorboards creak, Silas lifted a blanket and draped it over her. He stood for a moment longer than he should, watching her breathe, then turned away into his own silence. It was a week later when something happened that neither could pretend away. Clara was stirring stew when she startled, dropping the ladle into the pot with a splash. Her hands went to her stomach, her face paling, then softening into something close to wonder. Silas, rough hands still holding an axe handle from the yard, watched her chest rise and fall too quickly. "The baby's strong tonight," she whispered, more to herself than to him. He shifted, uneasy, but when she looked up, there was something vulnerable in her eyes that pulled him forward. Without a word, he set his hand, hesitant, almost trembling, against the fabric of her dress, near the swell of her belly. And then he felt it, a kick, firm, alive, undeniable. Clara's eyes filled, her voice breaking as she said, "He never felt his father's hand. Maybe it's enough that he feels yours." Silas Boone, a man made of silence, said nothing. But in that silence lived something new. Not judgment, not coldness, but the first flicker of grace. The days began to stretch longer, though winter still pressed its fist against the mountains. In the cabin, silence no longer sat between them like a wall. It breathed instead, carrying small gestures that stitched one life to another. Silas rose before dawn now, splitting wood with such steadiness that Clara never had to touch the axe. Clara, in turn, softened the cabin's rough edges. A scrap of cloth sewn into curtains, a jar filled with dried flowers, a quilt patched with care. The cabin that once felt like a grave in the snow grew warmer, brighter, as though the logs themselves sighed in relief. When they walked into town for supplies, folks noticed the change. Clara carried herself with a dignity that had been stripped from her months ago, and it was Silas who walked beside her. Not ahead, not apart, but beside. Martha Collins, an old widow with a sharp eye, muttered to another, "Boone's cabin isn't as dark as it used to be." But not every voice was kind. Zeke Turner leaned against the store's counter, arms folded across his chest. His words slithered like snakes. "That baby'll never be Boone's, no matter how she plays house. Man ought not fool himself." Clara's hand shook as she clutched the parcel of flour, shame and fury burning together in her chest. Before she could speak or break, Silas Boone turned. His voice, rough from disuse, carried like thunder through the store. "She's under my roof," he said, each word deliberate. "That makes her mine to stand for." The room stilled. A bucket dropped somewhere in the back. For the first time in years, Silas had spoken more than a sentence, and his words wrapped Clara in a protection stronger than any wall. She blinked against tears, lowering her head, but the smallest smile flickered at the corner of her mouth as they stepped out into the cold air together. The thaw of spring had not yet come when Clara doubled over one night, the cabin echoing with her cry. Silas, who had known fear only in the shape of rifles and storms, found himself gripped by a terror deeper than any he'd faced before. She clutched her belly, sweat beading her brow, whispering, "Too soon, oh God, too soon." He lifted her in his arms, awkward and desperate, laying her on the bed. Her hands gripped his shirt as waves of pain racked her body. Silas Boone, the man who had long abandoned prayer, bowed his head against the wood and whispered hoarsely, "Stay. Please, just stay." The night was long. Clara's cries mingled with the howl of the wind, the logs of the cabin creaking as if they too bore the weight of her labor. Silas held her hand, his thumb rough but steady, whispering clumsy reassurances he did not know he had in him. When dawn broke, the wail of a child filled the cabin. Clara, pale but alive, lay back with tears streaking her face. Silas held the infant boy in his hands, trembling as though he carried the most fragile treasure the world had ever made. The child's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, and the mountain man's silence cracked completely. He bent low, pressing his forehead to the baby's crown, and let the tears fall unhidden. The days after brought transformation neither had expected. Silas learned to move softly, to chop finer wood so the fire burned gentle for the baby. He carried Clara's water, tightened the shutters against drafts, rocked the infant in his arms as Clara slept. The mountain man's edges had been softened, not by force, but by the quiet weight of love he had not known he was capable of. One evening, as the fire glowed low, Clara whispered, "You've given me more than a roof, Silas. You've given me back dignity." Her hand rested lightly on his arm. He bowed his head, unable to speak, but his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of stone, but of reverence. By the time spring broke through the mountains, the three of them walked together into town. Clara carried the baby in her arms, his tiny bonnet shielding him from the breeze. Silas walked beside her, his broad shoulders bent slightly to her pace, supplies balanced in one hand, the other resting openly across her back. The town quieted as they passed. Whispers rose, but they no longer carried the venom they once did. Martha Collins, standing by the mercantile, nudged Zeke Turner sharply. "A man who learns grace is richer than any of us," she said, her voice like iron. Zeke said no more. For the first time, Silas Boone, who had hidden his heart behind mountains and silence, placed his arm around Clara in the open light of day. It was not a claim, but a shelter. She leaned into it, and the child stirred softly in her arms. And so the mountain man, who had sought only a cook to endure another winter, had received instead a woman who taught him grace, and a child who cracked the stone of his heart. Perhaps, friend, that is how grace finds us, not in grand sermons or declarations, but in small acts of holding on when another soul trembles. A blanket laid gently over weary shoulders. A rough hand resting near an unborn child. A voice raised, not to wound, but to defend. Silas Boone learned that even the hardest lives can be softened by gentleness. And perhaps that is the lesson for us all, that somewhere in this wide, harsh world, what we are truly searching for is not power, not riches, but someone who will remind us, when the fire burns low, that we are not forgotten.